The story's told of a bunch of Jewish people sitting around in the 1930s, each one reading a newspaper. And this one's reading the New York Times, says that the Jews are in despair. The next one's reading the New York Post, said that anti-Semitism is on the rise, and they don't know what to do. They're all sad about it. And they see their friend over there in the corner reading Der Stürmer, and which is like the Nazi propaganda paper. He says, well, why are you reading that paper? He says, well, you're reading that the Jews are downtrodden. You're reading that the Jews are terrible. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. I'm reading the Jews own the banks, the Jews own the media, the Jews are in charge of the world. So all kidding aside, there's a lot of anti-Jewish hatred and bias out there that is being hurled at the Jewish community, in particular regarding different quotes or misquotes, rather, from the Talmud and other places in Jewish tradition. And so we're going to try tonight to kind of go through some of them and sort of put them in context, what they mean. Here we go. The goal today is to clarify a few things. It's to clarify what is the Talmud, like what is it actually? What are the common misquotes and misconceptions about it? And what does Judaism actually say about non-Jewish people? Sound like fun? Okay. And really the quotes that are brought from the Talmud come in two specific categories. Number one, that the Talmud is anti-Christian, that the Talmud says things that are against Christians in particular. And number two, that it teaches immorality. It's against non-Jews at all, but it teaches immoral practices. And we're going to go through as much as we can about what that means. So Jew hatred has manifested itself over the years in many different ways. No matter what has happened, the Jews are always to blame, as we were talking about before. And the Jews are blamed for everything throughout history. When the Jews are wealthy, they control everything. They own the banks, they run the media. When the Jews are, as a group, poor in a certain country, they're the leeches on society. They're draining society. When they're found amongst the communists, oh, those are the capitalists. Those are the bankers. And when they're found amongst the capitalists, those Jews are communists. And so whatever context they find themselves, they're hated. There's always a reason pointed. And it's always the opposite. It's always a different thing in a different place. One of the things that it's said is that anti-Semitism is sort of like a mutating virus. Now, that doesn't mean that whatever I say is anti-Semitism, and that whatever you're going to say that is critical of someone that happens to be Jewish is anti-Semitism. That's nonsense, and I don't like the idea of just broad brushing any critique about anything that's going on in Israel, or anything that any Jew that did something wrong legitimately, that you just get to spray paint anti-Semitism. That doesn't work like that. But what anti-Semitism being a mutating virus means is that whatever the backdrop of civilization is at a given time, the Jews are seen as the anti-Jewish remarks or focus it mirrors that particular backdrop. So for example, when the backdrop of civilization is religion, let's say through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, when the backdrop of civilization is religion, so the anti-Semitism takes on a religious tinge. And the Jews are the Christ killers. The Jews are the ones that are cursed by God. When science is the backdrop of civilization, so the Jews are seen as genetically inferior, that they possess traits that aren't good. When social justice, as it is today, is sort of the backdrop of civilization, so then it gets sort of projected on the Jewish people or on Israel as genocidal, as warmongers, and so forth. Whatever the backdrop of society, the Jewish hatred shapes itself to that form. Okay, and so throughout history, the Talmud has been a main target of the attacks from enemies of the Jewish people. Modern Jew haters act also as if they just discovered some secret knowledge, something new that's never been addressed before, that's never been brought up before. It's like the secret Jewish laws that they just discovered from their own exploration of the Talmud. So what is interesting is that the Talmud has been examined over the centuries, as we're going to talk about, and even the most eminent Catholic author of the 19th century, Joseph Franz Molitor, who's the author of History of Philosophy, he says that the early church fathers took lessons from the Talmudists and embodied Talmudic tradition in their writings. He says not a single one of them even hints that the Jews had some sort of secret laws that they wanted to hide from the Christians. Now, in the post-October 7th world, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish crowd is all rehashing these same accusations that have come up throughout the course of history. And so the falsification of Talmudic texts and the distortion of their teachings are spread across and with increased vigor throughout the English-speaking world, especially with the magic of the internet. A single press of a button can share something to potentially millions of people. And the fact that these libels have been exposed repeatedly from the testimony not only of Jews, but also non-Jewish scholars throughout the century has not deterred some from attempting to portray the Talmud as sort of inferior and ethically immoral ethically. The thing is, with all of these things, when you take the text out of context, it can mean something completely different. In fact, it says, like I read over here, when you take the text out of context, you're left with just a con. And that's the way that it works. When you have something that is taken completely out of the context in which it is written, it can mean something completely different. And so it might seem incredible to the average person that the Jewish religion, the mother of all monotheistic religious justice and mercy in the world, should need to defend itself against these sorts of accusations. But throughout the centuries, this was the norm. This was something that rehashed itself multiple times throughout the centuries. Now, tonight, we're focusing mostly to clarify honest people's questions that are horrified when they see these quotes and ideas being expressed. Like all the scholars, the modern scholars say, haters gonna hate. And so this is not really to switch the minds of those who are dead set on Jew hatred. Nothing's going to change their minds. They're just going to say that, oh, he's lying and he's whatever. That's not the audience that we're talking to. The audience is people like you who may come across these quotes that are like, I know a lot of Jewish people and religious people that don't think like that, don't believe that. What's all this about? What is that? What is this? What is this? And so it's just to sort of discuss this in the broader context in which it falls. So far, so good? Good. Now, one of the major tenets of the Torah is that it was revealed at Sinai by God. And the Torah that was revealed at Mount Sinai consists of a dual nature. There is the written Torah, which is recorded in the 5 books of Moses, also in the prophets and the writings, as well as an oral tradition that was to be memorized and transmitted by the sages in every generation. And so accepting the veracity of the written text also demands that one accept the accompanying oral tradition that goes along with it. By way of analogy, the written Torah is almost like the outline or the shorthand for the class of the lecture, and the oral Torah is the lecture itself. Only one who heard the talk from the orator, from the lecturer, can make any sense of what the written outline is all about, while others are left sort of merely guessing at what the verses, commandments, or ideas mean. And so the Torah, the oral Torah and the written Torah work together to form what we call the Masorah. This is the manner in which the Jewish religion is conveyed one generation to the next. Now, the Torah text and even the oral tradition can be fairly evaluated only with in-depth theological understanding. Okay, so opening up the text of the Torah, and especially opening up the text of, let's say, the Talmud, it's like opening up the text of a pilot manual for an F-15, right? It's not meant for the uninitiated reader to peruse and then shortly after attempt to fly an F-15. Doesn't work like that. The manual has certain assumptions of the knowledge and the training that the reader possesses already. And without the previous background, it's simply impossible to try to make any sense of how the F-15 the manual, how it works and how it would even get off the ground. Okay, so the idea is that just as the reader of the F-15 manual can't get anywhere by whimsically determining the manual, what the manual means to him or her, so too Judaism has its own very specific guidelines and traditions regarding the study, the interpretation, and the application of the Torah. Any explanations of Torah that are outside of this, no matter how good they may seem, how nice they sound, is outside the scope of Judaism. So if I read something in the Torah text and I say, well, you know what that means to me? That means this. That's beautiful, that's wonderful, but that's not necessarily what it means, right? Each verse, each word, each commandment all comes with its own exact prescription of how it's fulfilled. Now, there are instances when the written text hints directly to an oral tradition. However, in most cases, it's that it can be deduced through logical necessity. So the truth of the matter is, there is not a single commandment in the Torah that can accurately be fulfilled just by the written text alone. I'll give you some examples of some of the commandments that we have. The mitzvah of tefillin, the commandment of tefillin, or sometimes translated as phylacteries. Not that that really helps or makes it more clear. But tefillin, the Torah commands us in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 8, to bind them as a sign upon your arm, and they shall be totafot between your eyes. Okay, well, what's supposed to be tied to your arm? With what do we tie it? Right? And what are totafot, for God's sakes? Another mitzvah, another commandment, ritual slaughter. When you're going to eat meat, it has to be slaughtered. You have to use shchita. It has to be slaughtered accordingly. That's from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 12, verse 21. Okay, what does it say over there? It says that God instructs the nation to slaughter from your herd and from your flock as I have commanded you. Well, if you look through the entirety of the written Torah, you will never find exactly how to slaughter. Where does one slaughter? What tool do you use to slaughter? Where on the animal do you make the cut? The details of kosher slaughter are extremely tedious and complicated, yet everyone does it the exact same way and always has. Where'd that come from? So it's a very apparent that there was further instruction that was orally related, that was orally conveyed. Now, sometimes there are verses in the Torah, by the way, that indicate specifically, right, outright tell us that there was an oral tradition accompanying. So, for example, in Exodus 24:12, it says, I shall give you the tablets of stone and the Torah and the commandment which I have written, right? Tablets of stone, the Torah, and the commandment, right? The tablets, the Torah, and the commandment, meaning all the explanations. Another verse that we have is from Leviticus chapter 26, verse 46. These are the chukim and the mishpatim and the Toros, plural, right? Only clear in Hebrew. The Toros, the Toros, which God established between himself and the children of Israel. So again, these are outright indications. Other places where we find it are Jewish holidays. Okay, Yom Kippur, what do we do? What's the main thing that everybody knows about Yom Kippur? What's the main way you commemorate it, you celebrate it? You fast, right? You know what the Torah says in the written text? Leviticus chapter 23, verse 27, you shall afflict yourself. Well, what's affliction? Right? Affliction for one could be different than the other. For me, affliction is going to the opera. For you, affliction is getting a root canal. I mean, like, what is affliction over here? And yet, across the board, everyone in every generation, nobody argues on this, no matter where they live. Yom Kippur, you fast. That's what it means. Everybody knows it. Shabbat, well, this will be our last example, but it can go through everything. Shabbat, keeping the Sabbath, one of the 10 commandments. Okay? There's no description of how in the written text as to how to keep the Sabbath. There's no description at all. All the laws are expounded upon only orally in the oral tradition. What is classified as forbidden work? How do I know? Right? What exactly are the details? And this is actually extremely important because biblically, if somebody purposefully and maliciously violates the Sabbath, you can be liable to the death penalty. Well, how can you make someone liable for the death penalty if You don't give them the laws. You don't tell them what's the parameters of Sabbath observance. Not what is considered work for me, what's considered work for you. Do I go to work? Do I not? What does it mean? And so only in the oral tradition does that exist. Now, in the face of Jewish persecution, this was always meant to be primarily oral and passed down orally, because the ideal environment for teaching Torah is in the land of Israel, with teacher to student and father to child, and being given over in a way where it's discussed. Again, the whole purpose is that the Torah shouldn't just be some reference book that sits on the shelf. It should be something that's actively engaged with all the time. Every verse peeled apart and discussed. It's meant to primarily be oral with the book as the guide. But the parameters of the book are meant to be carried over, again, to be given over in precision from teacher to student and parent to child. Now, in the face of Jewish persecution and dispersal from the land of Israel, significant content of the oral tradition was written down in order that it be preserved. Again, this was no simple matter. This was done out of necessity. So the Talmud is a record of perspectives and discussions on the phases of law and life that are culled from all of the outstanding Jewish teachers who functioned in the Academy of Jerusalem and then later Babylon during the 5th century CE. Okay, 1,500 years ago is about the time that it's really rife. Now, the earliest layer of the Talmud, which is called the Mishnah, is the product of Israel's scholarship, is written in clear, lucid Hebrew. Even when the oral tradition was put to writing, they tried to put as little in writing as possible because, again, it's meant to stay primarily oral. Just write down just enough that the tradition won't be forgotten. And as time passed and as the Jews were becoming more dispersed, for example, after the bloody Roman wars of 70 AD, 116 AD, or CE, I should say, and 135 CE, when the Jews were really being dispersed even more, then the center of Jewish life went from Israel to Babylon. That became the primary area in which the Jewish people found themselves. And so the vast scope of work of these volumes goes through the linguistic peculiarities in the Aramaic style in volumes and volumes and volumes that are very difficult to read for the average lay person. These are legal texts which primarily are meant to preserve the laws, right? And law and lore of all of Judaism. And so it's not, when you read a legal text, unless you're a lawyer, even in English, even in American law, which you might have some familiarity with, even still, like I went to vote. Right? We went to vote, and it talks about all the amendments, and it's using all this like legalese. I'm like, what are they talking about? It's in English, but I have no clue. What are they even like saying about what the law is? So in the Aramaic language, in this sort of like coded tomes, you have all of the lure and all of the law and lore of Judaism being preserved. Once the Mishnah itself was beginning to be forgotten, or needed clarification, the Gemara was all of the rabbis' discussion of the Mishnah. And so the Talmud itself is a compilation of the Mishnah and the Gemara, all the rabbinic discussions that were going on in the academies in order to preserve the oral tradition. The logic of back and forth of reasoning and trying to really build on what was being discussed, all of this back and forth are respected worldwide for sharpening the intellect. In fact, pretty recently in South Korea, the Talmud was like a bestseller. In schools, they were learning Talmud because of the way in which it sharpens the mind. So it functions like, the way that it functions, it sort of puts the entire conversation, the whole back and forth, playing devil's advocate, giving stories, and like a whole mix of conversations going on between the sages. It's almost like, remember in school, your math teacher would tell you when you're taking a test, show your work. When you're doing your homework or you're doing a test, show your work. Well, that functioned in two ways. When you show your work, number one, it proves you're not cheating. Right? Because you got to work it out. It's not just a bunch of answers. Proves you're not cheating. And secondly, if you answer the answer wrong, you can see as the steps go along where the math teacher can say, okay, this is where you went wrong on this. And so the Talmud, the collection of these discussions, sort of function in the same way. They function in a way that all of the original parameters, ideas, discussions of everything in Jewish law and lore are all discussed, not necessarily in a neat, packaged, formatted way. Like you can have on 3 pages of Talmud, they could go through 10 different subjects, just because, like in the same way that a conversation could go over here and go over there. But this is preserving the parameters of everything in Jewish law and lore. And what having an oral tradition does, a preserved oral tradition does, is it also enables us that no matter what new technology, whatever changes happen in society, I always know exactly what Jewish law and lore, how they would view this particular thing. So, for example, there's a commandment in the Torah, Leviticus chapter 23, verse 42, to live in a sukkah, to live in a booth for 7 days. Okay, well, what constitutes a sukkah? How do you build a sukkah? How do you build a booth? What is considered a valid sukkah? What parameters go in there? And so I'll give you a personal story how this applies to me. 10 years ago, when we bought our home, in the backyard, the previous owners had installed a tiki hut, right? And so the first thing that everybody asked me when we bought the house was, can you use the tiki hut as your sukkah? So even though the sages of the Talmud never heard of a tiki hut, I know, based on their discussions and based on what was derived from the parameters of what constitutes a sukkah, that my tiki hut could unfortunately not be used as a sukkah, right? Maybe a different tiki hut could be, but the way in which my tiki hut was created, no good as a sukkah. But so again, when you have this new technology, this new thing, even though the sages of the Talmud never heard of a tiki hut before, I know the application. And the same thing with all new technology. New technology comes out. Can I use it on the Sabbath or not? Well, we have all of the parameters of exactly what's what handsomely displayed in the oral tradition, and we can clearly know what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's not good, as things develop. So far, so good. So that's the oral tradition, that's the Talmud. Now, the early church and the Talmud, let's talk about that a little bit. The earliest attack on the Talmud itself goes back to the 6th century when the Emperor Justinian attempted to strip Judaism of its legal rights. And he was motivated by resentful anti-Jewish clergy who wrongfully accused the Talmud of blasphemy and blasphemy against the church. And Justinian then forbade the Jews from reading the law in their own language. Justinian banned the study of the Mishnah because, according to him, it distorted the Bible and thereby hindered Christian missionary activities. A lot of the early bans on the Talmud and problems with the Talmud was the fact that from their perspective, believing in Jesus is so obvious from Scripture that the only thing that must be pulling the Jews away from this its obviousness is the Talmud. The Talmud is teaching in a different way that the Scripture means something different. Otherwise, it's obvious, and so that was part of where the sort of animosity, I guess you could say, came from in the initial years. And then there were also people that were part of the early church that said that the Talmud has different references to the life of Jesus, the life of Mary, and that weren't spoken in particularly positive terms. So let's digress to that for just a moment. Jesus and the Talmud. Okay, I think it's worthwhile talking about it before we talk about all of the other instances where the Talmud was attacked. So there are several passages in the Talmud that are alleged by some to discuss the story of Jesus. Upon close examination, there are reasons that one either may or may not attribute these stories to the life of the Jesus of the New Testament. When taking it as a whole, there's a fair number of historians and Talmudists that question whether these passages do in fact refer to the Jesus of the New Testament, or alternatively, perhaps a sort of pseudo-Jesus who was then blurred into being made into the figure of the Jesus of the New Testament. Here's why it gets complicated a bit. Jesus is the Greek for Joshua, Yeshua. And so there are people in the Talmud that are referred to as Yeshu. Now, Yeshu, there's a lot of discussion as to what Yeshu means. Is that talking about, is that Jesus? Is that like a nickname, like a common thing, like you would call a Joshua Josh? You know, that's something that people go by. Was it a derogatory, that it means something derogatory? It means something else. And so there are several people that are referred to as Yeshu in the Talmud. And people assume that every one of these instances are talking about Yeshu, about Jesus of the New Testament. Now, why that's not so easy to conclude is because of there's a lot of part of the obscurity in exploring the Jesus that's mentioned in the Talmud is that there are many people in the Talmud with the same name. In the Talmud, you could have one name that refers to a lot of different people. And I'll give you an example. There are 14 people in the Talmud that are named Hillel. 14. And so to keep track of those, if you didn't know any better, you say, oh, they're all one person. Well, this one, they're born in different centuries and whatever, they have different teachers. But Hillel was a very common name, and so you have 14 Hillels. What's interesting about the Talmud is that John Meyer, who is a Catholic priest and considered to be one of the top scholars of the historical Jesus, he writes that Josephus, the first century historian, lists 20 different men named Jesus, and at least 10 of whom lived during the period of Jesus of the New Testament. Jesus was a very common name. Yeshua or Yeshu was a very common name. And so the truth is, even in the New Testament itself, there is a second character named Jesus. Colossians 4:11. There was a second character. There's a second person with that name. It was a common name. And so also the name Pandera, which is alleged to be the father of Jesus in the Talmud, in some Jewish literature, was also a common name in the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. And so in light of these, there are multiple theories as to who is this talking to? Who is this talking about? And so there is one Yeshu that is described as being living in the 1st century BCE, 100 years before the Jesus of the New Testament is claimed to live. And he started his own sect and had followers, and he was a student of Rabbi Yeshua ben Parachia. And he escaped persecution by fleeing to Egypt, and he returned as an idol worshiper, and he was executed the day before Passover. Okay, so and he had 5 disciples that were also killed. So there are certain, perhaps, similarities that you can glean from. There was another Yeshu that's described from the second century CE, 100 years after the Jesus of the New Testament, and he was during the time of the Roman persecution. He is known as Ben Pandera, but he's called Ben Stada, perhaps to differentiate him from the Ben Pandera that lived 200 years prior to him. And he brings also witchcraft from Egypt by carving names into his arm. And his mother Miriam, Mary, maybe, no. Maybe yes, maybe no, was a hairdresser also called Ben Stada. So it shows you how common the names were. And this Yeshu was a public idolater who was caught and executed in Lud the day before Passover. So again, even in these mentions of Yeshu, these are 2 Yeshus that had similar stories that lived, one 100 years prior to the Jesus of the Gospels, and the other one 100 years after the Jesus of the Gospels. So when scholars will look at these, it's unclear who exactly is being referred to. In fact, in the Blackwell Companion to Jesus, which is a compendium of all of the sort of historical biographical information that was not written by Jews. It says that there are scholars that analyze that some are minimalists. They say that the Yeshu that's mentioned in the Talmud, none of them, or maybe very few of them, are a reference to the Jesus of the Gospels. Some are like sort of in the middle, and some are maximalists, where any sort of indication, anyone that has the name, is all lumped together to be a reference to the Jesus of the New Testament. The point is that from a Jewish perspective, it's very difficult to say. Anybody who says otherwise, I think, is not giving justice to the tremendous amount of debate and scholarship that surrounds this particular matter. And Jews as a whole tend to accept the sort of historical existence of Jesus as a historical figure and the life gleanings that went down, but without the sort of any theological or religious aspect to it. Now, it's kind of like Jesus really plays no role in Jewish theology at all. Any references to him or to someone who has the same name in the Talmud are all sort of part of tangential discussions. It's not like you get to a certain volume or a certain page even of the Talmud, it says, these are the Jewish beliefs about Jesus. It's like these references are in passing mentioned in discussing broader things. He plays no role. He's not our guy. And so it's kind of like George Washington, right? George Washington, for Americans, he's like the center of everything. He's our hero. He's our founding father. He created this nation. He's the father of our country. Like, we revere George Washington. How do you think George Washington is taught in Britain? If he's taught at all, it's kind of like, it's like tangential. It's like not part of, Britain had a revolutionary, the Revolutionary War happened. Britain continued on, and George Washington is a blip in the history. And so Jews don't find themselves, discussing that it has no part in our normative theology. Unless if you're particularly interested in him or in that time period, and you've done extra research and you like the scholarship around it. I happen to be one of those people. I enjoy the history of it and sort of finding out about early Christianity and the breakaway from Judaism and how it all came. I'm personally interested in that. But as a whole, writ large, Jews are not thinking about the Jesus of the New Testament. And so, despite the fact that there are certain things that are lining up from the stories in the Talmud that can overlap with the Jesus of the New Testament, it doesn't necessarily point to that this shares anything to do with him at all. And I'll give you an example how that works on the other side of the foot. The story of Jesus of the New Testament, the Jesus that is revered today in the Christian world, shares a lot of the story and the things that he had accomplished overlap quite a bit with many of the pagan deities from other cultures. So Horus, for example, an Egyptian god, was born of a virgin, had 12 disciples, was resurrected. Mithras was a Roman god. He was born December 25th, had a virgin birth. Krishna, the Hindu god, again, a virgin birth. Dionysus, the Greek god, was born of a virgin, turned water into wine, died and resurrected. Okay, Zoroaster from Zoroastrianism, it was a Persian god, also born of a virgin. Buddha, also born of a virgin. So you see, there are many different, the Venn diagram of some of these other pagan cultures of what their god claimed to have done, or what they were revered for, is found in how Jesus is discussed in the Christian world. Now, an academic might say, well, if you see all of those things together, you might say that early Christians were influenced by the pagan world and adapted some of the attributes that were attributed to their own pagan gods prior to Christianity. And so maybe yes, maybe no. But if you ask a Christian, is that the case? No, that just happens to be that they line up. Okay, fine. In the same way that they can line up when talking about pagan gods, the same way that there can be certain similarities with the Yeshus that are mentioned in the Talmud. Right? So it's not, we don't know who and what is even being referred to tangentially in these discussions in the Talmud. And there's very few of them anyway. The Talmud is 60 plus volumes. So if you have a handful of things that tangentially mention a Yeshu, it's disparaging. This is certainly not a collective view of Judaism's approach to the founder of Christianity, to Christians writ large. Has nothing to do with nothing. So far, so good. Okay, so we said again the first attacks from the Talmud comes from Justinian. Then in 638 CE, you have the Jews of Spain who were to hand over all of their Jewish books, including the Talmud. The most infamous trial of the Talmud and the burning took place in France during the 13th century. You know, and I got to say something. Who is the one that usually has the most animosity towards Jews? Other Jews. In fact, and I find this across the board from folks in general, if a person's religious faith didn't work out for them, sometimes, and whatever, they had a bad experience, whatever the case may be, sometimes they develop such an animus towards the faith that becomes like their religion. I've met Christians over the years who have left Christianity, and they have so much vitriol towards Christianity because they have resentment and all these things. Like, ease up, easy. It didn't work, it wasn't for you, whatever, but like, you don't have to make your entire religion bashing Christianity. Well, it works the same way in the Jewish community. Sometimes the greatest accusers and the greatest damage causers in the Jewish world, unfortunately, are other Jews who have left the fold, or their religion as an ideology doesn't work for them, or they don't embrace it, and so they wind up having an axe to grind, and they wind up becoming the biggest enemies of the Jews. So in Paris in 1240, there was a person named Nicholas Donin. He was a Jew who had renounced his faith, and he told the authorities in France that the Talmud contained blasphemies against the church. He had an axe to grind, and that's how he expressed it. And so in the year 1240, Nicholas Donin presented to Pope Gregory IX a formal accusation against the Talmud, and he prepared different excerpts that were supposedly showing anti-gospels, anti-Jesus, and anti-everything. And so the essence of these allegations were that the Talmud is the source of Jewish stiff-neckedness, right? If it weren't for the Talmud, the Jews would all convert to Christianity. And the Talmud contains blasphemies against the Christian religion. That was his claim to the Pope. And so in the year 1240, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, and 3 others from the Tosfos school were forced to defend the merits of Judaism and the Talmud. And so, among other things, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris used the chronological discrepancy to discuss that there are multiple Yeshus. He says that the Yeshus in the Talmud, there are multiple ones, and one of them is 100 years before the Jesus of the Gospels. One of them is 100 years after the Jesus of the Gospels. And so it's not referring to the one that you're thinking of. And he quipped a very interesting quip. He said it was King Louis IX of France at the time who was overseeing all of this. And he says, not every Louis is king of France. And so he won the battle, but he ended up losing the war. The Talmud was condemned to be burned. And interestingly enough, there was an archbishop at the time that was friendly to the Jewish community, and he prevented that sentence from being carried out. But then soon later, he died, he suddenly died. And this was viewed by some of the more fanatical elements within the church as like a sign. That's what he gets for being friendly to the Jews. And unfortunately, thereafter, on the first Sabbath of Lent in the year 1242, 24 cartloads of the Talmud, of manuscripts of the Talmud, were carried off and publicly sent to be burned, right in the town square in France, in Paris. Now, this triggered a series of like incidents throughout Europe. There was another incident with Pablo Cristiani, you guessed it, a Jew who had left Judaism, and Cristiani, that was his adapted name, right? And so he came, and the Ramban, Nachmanides, was forced to debate him. And the outcome, with all of these sorts of debates, it's like heads I win, tails you lose. It's like if you win, the Jews are dispersed. If not, the Talmud is burned. I mean, like there's no winning over here. And so at the end of the debate, and these debates, by the way, are all recorded. You can see the back and forth. It's actually quite interesting to read. The disputation of Barcelona and the Yechil of Paris in France. But afterwards, the Talmud was ordered once again to be burned in the year 1263. In 1264, Pope Clement IV decreed that any person caught learning the Talmud or with a Talmud in his possession would be put to death. Once again, in 1299 and 1309, the Talmud was publicly burned in Paris. Again, in 1322, by order of Pope John XXII, the Talmud was again publicly burned. In 1415, Pope Martin V ordered that all copies of the Talmud be destroyed. During the Spanish Inquisition in 1490, there was an order of large-scale burnings of the Talmud. In Germany, during the first half of the 16th century, the Dominican order was instigated by, guess who? Johannes Pfefferkorn, right? A Jew. He was a butcher who had been convicted of theft. He was a Jew, born a Jew. A butcher who was convicted of theft. He converted to Christianity and then went on a personal crusade against Judaism. And he nudged the Dominican order to come against the Talmud, come against the Jews. When the Roman Inquisition established itself in 1542, there followed a series of public burnings of the Talmud. In 1533, Pope Julius III decreed that the books of the Talmud be burned. Similar incidents happened in Holland in 1559 and in Poland in 1757. Okay, now we're in modern times. The most slanders against the Talmud in modern times can be labeled as made in Germany. Okay? The father of modern libels against the Talmud is a person by the name of John Andreas Eisenmenger in the 1700s. He wrote a book called Judaism Unmasked, and it's a collection of all sorts of Jewish books and rabbinic texts, and it served as a source of the detractors of Talmudic literature down to the present day. He's like the Bible of anti-Jewish sentiment, that all the quotes from the Talmud come to this very day. So if you see a website with fake Talmud quotes or distorted Talmud quotes, this is ultimately likely the source. He was a professor who studied Eastern and Middle Eastern societies. He studied the Hebrew language, he studied the ancient Hebrews, and he studied rabbinical literature. And he actually posed as a convert for 19 years, that he was in the process of converting. And so he went on a real lifelong mission, a lifelong tirade, in order to really get to the core and get the Talmud in depth. And so his book is, we don't really know exactly what drove him. There's legends that say that one time he was in a synagogue of Rabbi David Lida, and he made some a non-complimentary remark about Christianity, and he didn't like it. And then also he encountered 3 Christians who had converted to Judaism, and he was so taken with it that he made it his life's mission to make sure that no one's going to ever convert to Judaism ever again, and I'm going to make it my mission to destroy Judaism. And so he was repulsed by these things, and the book is very scholarly. There's a lot of footnotes. I actually own the book. I went through it. It was eye-opening, to say the least. But the book, if you actually go through it, and it was actually gone through by non-Jews, right? The official encyclopedia of German biographies, published by the German Imperial Academy of Science in 1876, went through this and described it as follows. Taken as a whole, it's a collection of scandals. Some passages are misrepresented, others are insinuations based on one-sided inferences, and even if this were not the case, a work that is made with the object for its object to present the dark side of Jewish literature cannot give us a proper understanding of Judaism. This is a non-Jewish group, the German Imperial Academy of Science. Reviewed the book, went through it, says it's essentially garbage. Okay, there were others also that went through it. There was a German theologian, Gustav Dahlmann, who wrote that it could be no more faithful a representation of Judaism than an indiscriminate collection of everything superstitious and repulsive about Christian literature that could be termed that to make that characterization of Christianity. To take every superstitious and repulsive thing said in Christian literature to say that's Christianity. He says the shoe's got to, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. There was a more spectacular attempt at again, going after the Talmud, Dr. August Rawling. He was a professor of Hebrew antiquities, and anti-Semitism in Austria at the time in the 1800s was really rife, and he took advantage of that. And he decides, I'm going to write a book that goes through all reasons to be against the Jews. He essentially took Eisenmenger's book and rewrote it, reformatted it, whatever, and he published a book called The Talmud Jew. The Talmud Jew, which became a bestseller, had 17 editions. And he actually changed meanings in order to make it that it's against the Christians. So for example, in the Talmud talks about, it uses the word for idolaters, for pagans. It uses the acronym Akum. Akum stands for Oivdei Koichavim U'Mazolos, those who worship the stars and constellations, pagans. He changed it that Akum really means Oivdei Christus Miriam, those who worship Jesus and Mary. He purposely changed it in order to give it an anti-Christian tinge. Not to mention, as we're going to talk about very soon, that all references to non-Jews in the Talmud are all talking about evil pagans that lived prior to that time. Okay, so he changed the meanings, and again, anti-Semitism is rife. You have a very active audience that's willing to, and so Rawling, he rehashed some of the worst medieval libels and concerning all of the hateful and debased things that are supposedly written in the Talmud. And Rawling made an offer that if he could be proven wrong, he'll give you 1,000 silver coins. So, right, and this was meant to be going onto a court case, and they was going to. So what happened like this? One rabbi decided, all right, you're on 1,000 silver coins, right? He said, I will give you 3,000 silver coins if you can read a single page of Talmud in the original Aramaic. You pick the page, you read it to me, you tell me what it means. Go for it. 3,000 silver coins. And so his name was Joseph Block. Rabbi Block wrote articles about how ignorant Rawling was of the Talmud, and he accused him of ignorance and perjury, that he was saying all sorts of lies. And so as a professor of theology, August Rawling had to respond to this very public challenge or lose all credibility. And so when the trial could no longer be postponed anymore, Rawling decided he's going to withdraw completely and tacitly acknowledging defeat. I actually have over here an English copy of Joseph Block's critique, and this is a complete takedown, not only from Jewish literature, but from other non-Jews, other Christian theologians that went through his claims and made it that it's garbage, that it's all garbage claims. This goes through most of the claims that are against the Jewish people and takes it down like Texas Chainsaw Massacre style, like just completely obliterates the whole thing. And it's if you're into scholarship, it's quite an interesting read. If you're not into scholarship, just take my word. It's an interesting read, whatever. But we have, again, it's a complete. Okay, now. There was another case, and I'm bringing these cases just to show you that it's ignorance after ignorance after ignorance, and dispelled, all debunked each time. Okay, so there was another, guess who? Jew, born a Jew, Aaron Bryman. He went by also Dr. Justice, not Dr. Justice like a superhero, Justice, okay. And he was born a Jew, and he actually aspired for a career as a Jewish scholar. But when he lost face with the Jewish community because he abandoned his wife and children, he converted to Catholicism, then to Protestant, then back to Catholic. He was going all around the block. And his principal work was called Der Judenspiegel, right? The Mirror of the Jew. Okay? And this was, again, written to show that there's animosity specifically towards Christians. And yeah, so Professor Franz Delitzsch, the famous Protestant theologian, pronounced that again, a Protestant theologian is going through this. He pronounced that the Judenspiegel is a concoction of damnable lies. Not a Jew. We're talking about a Christian theologian who goes through all of these claims that are just a rehashment of Eisenmenger and just a rehashment of Rowling. Okay, same quote, same idea, same thing, and goes through it and calls it a concoction of damnable lies. So these same forgeries were then later published, once again, by Jacob Ecker, who also offered his own viewpoints. It's the same quotes, the same idea, just recycled. There's another interesting case, and this will be our last case that we discussed before we get into some of the nitty-gritty. Okay, in Tsarist Russia, there was a notorious anti-Semite, anti-Jew named Justinus Pranetis. He was a Catholic clergyman, and his book is called The Talmud Unmasked, or it's sometimes titled The Christian and Jewish Talmud. It's a collection of purported quotations from the Talmud that claim to demonstrate that Judaism despises non-Jews and promotes the murder and injury of non-Jews in certain instances. So to create the impression of authenticity, okay, he cites many passages in the original Hebrew, in the original Aramaic, but most of them are just lifted from Eisenmenger's original anti-Jewish tirade. So by identifying any term, nuanced term that's used in the Talmud, things like haaretz, illiterate person, akum, an idol worshiper, an apikoros, heretic, Kuthim, Samaritans, which are a specific type of idol worshiper. He took all of those different references that the Talmud doesn't speak very nicely on. They're all pagans who are involved in the worst practices. He took them all and translated them as, you guessed it, Christians. And so in 1912, Pranetis testified in the blood libel case of Menachem Mendel Beilis in Russia. Anyone heard of the Beilis trial? Beilis was accused of murdering a Christian child to take his blood for alleged Jewish rituals. That was the claim, right? The famous blood libels. So Pranetis was called as an expert witness to testify, right? If you have this Jew who did something terrible, for his religion, we have to get this expert who knows all about the Talmud and what the Jews believe and everything. And so he was called to testify to the Talmud's hatred of Christians. And so when confronted by the bulls of Pope Innocent IV and Clement XIV, which denounced ritual murder charges against Jews, he said that writing that they were libels and slander, and called for Christians to desist from that. So Pranetis said it wasn't a genuine document. I don't believe it. And then it happened to be that the Papal Secretary of State examined the originals from the Vatican and certified that these were in fact genuine. And what happened after that is his credibility sort of rapidly evaporated. And when the defense, defending Mendel Beilis, when they were questioning Pranetis, they demonstrated his ignorance of certain simple Talmudic concepts and definitions, things like the titles of the volumes, Chulin, Erevin, Baba Basra. These are the volumes, the names of the volumes. Again, 60 plus volumes, just the names of the Talmud. To the point where many in the audience were occasionally laughing out loud when it became how clear that he was so confused and it was intelligibly unable to answer the questions from Beilis's lawyer. Beilis was found not guilty. And unfortunately today, though, the Talmud Unmasked is still being distributed by extreme right-wing, extreme left-wing, clerical circles, and can be accessed from various anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic websites that are out there. Okay? So it's, again, those same quotes. You go on, you say, like, what do, Jews in the Talmud or whatever. You'll find all sorts of websites out there that have all of these quotations, and the quotations on the surface look like, whoa. But, as we're going to go through, at least some of them, they're all based on nothingness. Now, and again, this is not only the Jewish point of view, this is non-Jews as well. Certain famous non-Jewish defenders of the Talmud are Johannes Ruchlin in the 1400s. He was one of the first Germans that were fluent in Hebrew, and he actually debated the apostate, so the heretic Pfefferkorn that we talked about. He debated him. Then we have Franz Delitzsch in the 1800s. We have Hermann Strack, who was a Protestant theologian and Orientalist. He actually authored a book called Secret Jewish Laws, proving that Jewish law was transparent and advocated equal treatment of Jews and non-Jews. Again, a Christian theologian. Karl Wunsch was an evangelical theologian and an expert in Hebrew. Again, took all of these books, these claims, and just completely debunked them. Theodor Noldeck, Paul Kahl, a Protestant theologian and Orientalist. This is, again, things that have century after century not only been dismissed and debunked by Jews and rabbis, but by Christian theologians as well. So where do these quotes come from? They come from an amalgamation of 4 areas. Pure invention. Some of them are like completely made up. Either the quote is made up, the book doesn't exist, whatever it is. Mistranslations or selective quoting. Out of context quotes, right? So in other words, it might be talking about a specific legal case, not some like broad understanding of something. And then there is the purposeful replacement of any mention of sinners, trespassers, pagans, wicked people, all being translated as Christians, right? Purposely translated as that to make a point. Now, I do want to make this point before we go into some of the texts themselves, that the religions of the world today, the non-Jews of the world today, are not at all the non-Jews that are being discussed in the Talmud. And already from the Middle Ages, our sages told us that any time the Talmud talks about anything disparaging about non-Jews, it's talking about the pagans amongst whom they dwell, and prior to that. Okay, so it's talking about people that were engaging in public sexual orgies, that were sacrificing their children, that were idol worshippers and engaged in all sorts of magical practices, not the non-Jews today. The very first to make this point is Rabbi Menachem Meiri, one of the great Rishonim, one of the great medieval sages. He said the notion of idolatry has absolutely disappeared from the world, except for some fringe elements. And idolatry, in his view, has essentially become extinct and replaced by a more developed religions. He refers to them as nations that are restricted by the ways of religion, that are bound by a transcendent code of ethics, as opposed to idolaters of old who thrived on total anarchy. And in his commentary to Baba Basra and the Gemara, the Talmud, all the people of the nations that are restricted by the ways of religion, he writes, and worship the divinity in any way, right? Even if their faith is far from ours, are excluded from the principle of inequality. Any disparaging term in the Talmud against non-Jews does not apply to modern non-Jews. Does not apply to upright Christians, Muslims, and any other people that are living in civil religion. It just doesn't exist. The world is a different world that the Talmud is referring to. They are considered, he continues, they are considered like full-fledged Jews with respect to the matters of any sort of civil discourse, with no distinction whatsoever. This idea was continued when we talked earlier about Rabbi Yechiel Paris, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, in his debate with Nicholas Donin. What he said over there is that he says that the Gentiles that lived in Talmudic times were completely different. And he said, take this as a rule. Whenever the word goy is mentioned in the Talmud, meaning someone from the other nations, that it should be as if it refers to the 7 nations, the 7 Canaanite nations who occupied the land of Israel and were involved specifically in particularly corrupt practices. That's what it's referring to, not the people amongst whom we dwell. And this sentiment was carried throughout the centuries. The Maharal of Prague writes, anyone who accepts upon himself the worship of the first cause, becomes thereby a resident stranger, meaning he's not Jewish, but he's completely our equal, our partner, our brother in every way. Rabbi Moshe Rifkis, right, said all of the disparaging content that anything is lobbed against the pagans, the Gentiles in the times of the Talmud, are talking about idolaters of earlier times that didn't believe in God, that didn't believe in the Exodus. But concerning temporary Gentiles, he writes, these laws do not apply because their intent is to the Creator. You ask a Christian, what God do you believe in? He says, I believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who gave the Torah to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz, another great sage, one of our key sages, he writes, the Christians amongst whom we live, whom we are living, follow right and justice. They believe in the creation of the universe, in divine providence, in the law of Moses. They believe in the words of the prophets. It's therefore incumbent upon us to promote their welfare, to praise, to honor, and to bless them. Ooh, scathing. The Maritz Chias, another great sage from our Talmudic commentary, Christians who believe in the fundamentals of religion, in the Torah from heaven, in the existence of God, in the reward and punishment in the world to come, and the rest of the fundamentals of basic faith principles are doubtlessly deemed by us as resident strangers, meaning complete equals in all civic matters. They're not Jews, but they're treated like they're not Jewish people, just by theological implication, but as far as any civil discourse, any civil matters, they're looked upon in the same way. Friends, brothers, everything. Rabbi Escalando makes a similar point. Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein in the Torah Tamima. All the discriminatory laws apply to those idolaters back in the day. Through the centuries, this is the trend. Now, although Nicholas Donin's expose of the Talmud leaves a person to believe that the impression that the Talmud is filled with anti-Christian hatred and venom, there's very little, if any, reference to Christianity in the Talmud. Edward Flannery was an American priest. He was the Roman Catholic Diocese of Providence, and the author of the book, The Anguish of the Jews. He writes that the Talmud sins not with exposing too much, but it's silence with respect to Christianity. In other words, if the Talmud is sinning in any way, it's that it's silent. It doesn't mention Christianity. There's nothing that can be learned from it. So let's go through some of the quotes. And remember, taking everything that we've discussed until now as sort of a backdrop. So, even if you want to say that's without what we talked about, that the Christians of today and the non-Jews of today are different than the pagan idolaters of that time, even with that aside, we can still see how these quotes are out of context in their own right. Let's do some of the famous ones. Okay, and just for the sake of time, we're going to do a few. Okay, I am going to post, God willing, in this video some websites that have references to more. If a person wants to read more about it, go into the details of other things you come across, I'd be happy to post a link. Okay, let's go through some of the famous ones, though. The claim is, the Jews consider in the Talmud, Gentiles are not human. Okay. The quote is from Yevamos 61b and Bava Metzia 114b. Now, this is based on a phrase in the Talmud, Atem kuruyim Adam, you are called Adam, but idolaters are not called Adam, are not called human. Okay? And so the idea that they derive from this, the Jew haters that bring this up, is the idea that the Jews regard themselves as human. They're called Adam, but not Gentiles, and everyone else is like non-human. Well, that idea that Jews are human and non-Jews are not runs contrary to several fundamental principles of Judaism. We believe that God created humanity, that we're all descendants of Adam and Eve, we're all descendants of Noah, we're all human, we're all equally human. Okay, so that's obviously not what is being discussed in the Talmud, obviously. To anyone who has any semblance of knowledge of what Judaism is about, that shouldn't even be a question. So what does it mean when it says you are called Adam and they are not Adam? So the discussion is about ritual impurity. And it quotes the verse from Numbers 19:14 that a man, Adam, who dies in a tent, right, which which is a law of when a person passes away, a Jewish person passes away. If you go near them, you contract ritual impurity. Now, and they derive that it's only a reference to the Jewish community based on a verse in Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 31, which also uses this word Adam, and it's in speaking to a Jewish audience in that context. So this ritual only applies to the Jews. Okay, let's backtrack a second. The Talmud itself calls non-Jews Adam many times. The Gemara in Gittin refers to Gentiles as Bnei Adam, the children of Adam, right? They are called Adam. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah uses the term Ha'adam to refer to Gentiles. It also says that an Adam, a Gentile, that learns Torah, that learns civic morality, is compared to the high priest. Ooh, scathing, right? So again, the term Adam is used, we certainly believe, obviously, it sounds even like embarrassing to have to like explain this, but yes, every human is indeed a human, okay? Even according to the Talmud. And so these descriptions, these gleanings from these verses are telling us that when it comes to ritual matters, sometimes the word Adam is used to represent specifically the Jews, because they are commanded in these laws. So in other words, in ritual matters, in Torah matters that are relevant to the Jews, sometimes the word Adam is used just as a reference to the Jews. Why is the word Adam used? Okay. Now, in Hebrew, there are 4 terms for the word human. There's Adam, there's Ish, there's Gever, and there's Enosh. Now, in English, that would be like there's man, there's person, there's human being, and there's Homo sapien. They're essentially saying the same thing. Now, in Hebrew, each of those 4 terms, those 4 names, has a singular and a plural form, except for Adam. Except for Adam. There's 1 Ish, 2 Ishim. 1 Enosh, 2 Anashim. Right? 1 Gever, 2 Gvarim. But Adam has no plural. In Hebrew, you don't say 2 Adamim. There's no plural for it. And so the word Adam is a reference to the unity of the Jewish people. Why is it a reference to the unity of the Jewish people? When the Jewish people received the Torah at Sinai, in Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 and 2, it says, "In the 3rd day on this month, the Jewish nation arrived at Sinai desert." And in the very next verse, we read, "And they arrived at the Sinai desert, and they encamped there." And when the Torah again says, and Israel encamped there opposite the mountain. Grammatically speaking, in all the places in the Torah that describe the encampments in the desert, it always uses the plural form of vayisu, meaning and they traveled, v'yachanu, and they encamped. Okay? Vayisu, and they traveled, v'yachanu, and they encamped. There's one exception to that rule when they get to Sinai. When the Jews get to Sinai, it says vayichan, which literally means, and he camped. That's before the giving of the Torah, because at the giving of the Torah, Rashi says, they were ish echad, belev echad. They were completely united, like one body with one soul. They were like one individual person. So when it comes to describing Jewish ritual matters, it uses the term Adam because the term Adam is not plural. Because we are described as one individual, when we receive the Torah, sometimes the rituals that are specific to the Jewish community are referred to as Adam, the only term that doesn't have a plural. See how that works? You might compare it to the term person that's mentioned within every country's code of law. And so in which the term is frequently used only for citizens. When you talk about a person in a code of law, sometimes it's only talking about the persons of that particular country, residents of that particular country, despite the fact that the definition of person means a human. That could be a similar comparison. Okay, so yes, many times in the Torah, many times in the Talmud, Gentiles are referred to as Adam. There are cases where it's only a reference to the Jewish people, and it's about ritual law that only the Jewish people are are commanded in. And it uses the word Adam because Adam is one that's not plural, which emphasizes the unity of the Jewish people. So far, so good. So clearly not saying Gentiles are not human. Complete distortion. Here's another great one. This is a quote from supposedly the Libre David, and it's a popular quote on the internet. All these websites will have this quote. It says this, very like scary. To communicate anything to the goy, right? Anything to the Gentile about our religious relations would be equal to the killing of all Jews. For if they knew what we teach about them, they would kill us openly. If a Jew is called upon to explain any part of the rabbinic books, he ought to give a false explanation. And whoever violates this order shall be put to death. That's extreme.
They say that's said in Talmud.
No, they quote the Libre David. The only problem is the Libre David doesn't exist. I mean, I've really legitimately searched for this book. Despite being quoted on many anti-Talmud, anti-Semitic sites, there's no trace of such a book to ever existed. I asked around, I Googled, I looked in internet databases for obscure Sfarim. I cannot find this book. And so whether or not this book ever existed, certainly whatever this person, whatever this rabbi or whatever was conveying in it is definitely not mainstream rabbinic thought. I don't even think the book ever existed, to be honest. But it's interesting also, it's ironic that the author of this statement did exactly what he was preaching against. Right? He was trying to avoid Gentiles viewing our religion as racist, supposedly. But instead, due to his thoughtless statement, he caused the very opposite. Right? He's now being quoted as the source for Judaism as being racist. The source does not exist. I've never seen it. I looked even in books that maybe could have, resembled the name, and looked in the source of where it would be said. I didn't find anything that looked like it. So that's that. Okay, next one, a great one. Gentiles are in a state of filth their entire life. That's the allegation. Okay, now that's the alleged quote from Avodah Zarah 36b. What it actually says is that non-Jews are in a state of nida their entire lives. The intention here is that what is nida? Nida is during a woman's menstrual cycle, husband and wife are not allowed to be together. Right? That is a prescription from the Torah. During the menstrual cycle, they're not supposed to have relations, not supposed to not have any relationship with each other. Nida really means separation. It doesn't mean filth. Right? It's not just talking about the menstrual cycle, and that's not the goal over here. The idea is that they're considered nida. What does that mean? They're considered nida their whole life. For the sake of marriage, Gentiles, non-Jews, are considered nida. They're considered separate from the Jewish community. It's no secret that the Jewish community promotes marrying within your faith, because that's the way that you carry forth the traditions, that you preserve your own identity. Right? And that has nothing to do with anything else except for preserving your own faith, carrying it forward. Fine. So when it says that Gentiles are considered in a state of nida, meaning they're considered sexually, maritally separate from you for their whole life. In fact, it uses the same word nida to describe unmarried Jewish girls. Right? An unmarried Jewish girl is considered in a state of nida. Not that she's menstruating, but it means that you're forbidden to have relations with her. Why? Because sexual relations, are only permitted in marriage in Judaism. And so she's in a state of nida, meaning she's meant to be separated from you. Unless you're married to the person, you're not supposed to engage in relations. Period. Not filth. But they purposely translate it as filth because menstrual cycle, complete fabrication. Here's a good one. This might be even the most famous one. Quote from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in Maseches Sofrim, which is actually not a Talmudic text, but that's a side point. Even the best of the Gentiles should be killed, right? And you're laughing because it's so ridiculous that Jews would even that Jews think like this. No one's ever heard of this. No one's ever thought. Where does this come from? When you look up, okay, again, the quote Maseches Sofrim. Okay, the initial quote of this idea: the best of the Gentiles should be killed. Okay, the original source is from the Mechilta, a commentary on Exodus chapter 14, verse 7. And here's how it goes. At this point in Exodus, the Jewish people have left Egypt, but have not yet crossed the Sea of Reeds. Okay, now the Egyptian people, after they've suffered 10 plagues, have buyer's remorse or seller's remorse or whatever, and they get their chariots together, and what happens? They start chasing after the Jewish people to kill them, to get them, to bring them back, do whatever, to harm them. And so the Mechilta asks a question, right? These chariots that were pulled by horses, where do these horses come from? Where do they come from? They just had 10 plagues that destroyed all of Egypt and destroyed, some of the plagues were directed directly at animals. So where do these animals come from? So the Mechilta writes, from where do these animals come from that were steering these chariots? If you say they were from Egypt, doesn't it say in Exodus 9:6, and all the livestock of Egypt died in the 5th plague? If you're going to say that they were pharaohs, doesn't it say in Exodus 9:3 that Moses said to Pharaoh, behold, the hand of God is on your livestock? Couldn't have been pharaohs. Couldn't have been the Egyptians. They all died in the plague. If you say it was the Jews, right? If you're going to say it was the Jews, doesn't it say in Exodus chapter 10, verse 26, and your livestock as well will go with us, and our livestock as well will go with us, not a hoof will be left. Meaning when we leave Egypt, we're taking all of our livestock. So if it wasn't the Egyptians, and it wasn't pharaohs, and it wasn't the Jews, who are these horses? Where'd they come from? And so the Mechilta answers, it came from the righteous, the God-fearing Egyptians. The God-fearing Egyptians who believed in God, they were spared of the plagues, and these were their animals. However, those same good Egyptians, God-fearing Egyptians, are now on chariots, and their horses are coming after you for war. They want to kill you or enslave you again. So even the best of the Egyptians, when you're in war, you kill. When you're fighting, when the Egyptians, even the best of the Egyptians was trying to kill the Jews or trying to enslave the Jews. So even the best of the Egyptians should be killed. That is the context. Okay? And so, in other words, Rabbi Shimon's teaching is not a blanket statement, right, to kill all of the Gentiles, or the best of the Gentiles should be killed. It's talking about in the Egyptian pursuance of Israel, in the Egyptian pursuance of the Jewish people as they're about to cross into the Sea of Reeds. That it was the righteous ones it's their animals, and even they were attacking. So in the course of war, when someone is coming to attack you, even if in other instances they might be labeled as a good and upright person, if someone comes to attack you, you can kill them. Don't consider, well, this is really, in other contexts, he's a good guy. If he's got a gun to your face, he's got a chariot, so he's trying to bring you back, you get rid of him. So to take this out of context and broad writ say that the Jewish people are saying, oh, you could kill it, it's so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. Let's go through another one, right? You like this? We'll do a few more. A few more. We'll do a few more. The claim, here's the claim. Here's the claim. Jews may steal from non-Jews. From Bava Metzia is the quote. Okay, so firstly, the quotes that are usually brought up with this are talking about the returning of lost objects. The question of returning a lost object is, how far does a person need to go to return a lost? You're walking in the street, you find a lost object. How far do I have to go? Okay. Now, in Bava Metzia, it says that if a Jew finds an object that's lost by a non-Jew, it does not have to be returned. Now, why? Why? So the idea of when does an object become ownerless after it's lost, right, is when the owner gives up hope of ever finding it, of ever getting it back. So as soon, and the exact parameters of that are discussed throughout the Talmud. So in other words, if I have something that has my name on it and my address on it, I might still think that I'm going to get it back for longer. But if it has no name and no address and whatever, then chances are, I'm not getting this thing back. So if a flood comes and my wallet and my items were taken, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to get those things back. Okay, so far so good. So as soon as the owner despairs of ever getting it back ever again, the object is considered ownerless, and anyone is free to take it. Now, in pagan societies, there were no laws on the books. There was no civic code of returning lost objects to one another. That didn't exist. And so if something belonged to a non-Jewish person, automatically they despaired of ever getting it back because that wasn't a thing that people did. There was no lost and found. Finders keepers. And so if you found something that belonged to a non-Jew, you knew already that he despaired on it in pagan times because he wasn't going to get it back. If it didn't have his name on it, didn't have any sort of indication, he knew he wasn't getting this thing back. There was no, again, civic code of doing that. And so if you found something that you're sure belonged to him, it's ownerless. You can acquire it. It's not stealing. It's acquiring something that's ownerless. Amongst the Jewish community, if you were living in a Jewish circle, there was that civic obligation to return it. And so it would take longer for someone to expect, to regret on ever finding it again. And so if you found something of a Jew, you had to go out of your way to return it. Now, in our days, because we live in a society that is part of the civic moral code of how things go, of course we should return an object to someone that we find. If you're walking down the street and you find something that belongs to somebody, even if you know that they're not Jewish, of course you should return it. Of course. It's not even a question. In those days, again, they despaired of ever getting it back because that wasn't part of the civil structure. Now, as far as actively stealing from a non-Jew, this is specifically prohibited in multiple places in our tradition. For example, the Shulchan Aruch, Hayshon Mishpat, it says that anyone who steals even a minor amount violates the prohibition of Leviticus 19:11. You shall not steal, and is required to pay the amount that was stolen, whether one steals from a Jew or from a non-Jew. Clear as day. Okay, and this is echoed throughout previous halachic sources. And so it's actually, in many ways, considered worse if a person steals from a non-Jew. Because not only are you stealing, and not only are you obligated in stealing, but you're committing a chilul Hashem. You're desecrating God's name. You're making the Jewish people and the Torah look bad. So it's even worse to steal from a non-Jew. So this idea that, it says that Jews can steal from non-Jews is insane, is ridiculous. It's completely inapplicable. It's completely out of context. Let's do another one. This is one that really, so this is one that isn't about non-Jews per se. This is about immorality in the Talmud. This is the claim, and the quote is from several tractates of the Talmud, that intercourse with a young girl is permissible if she's under 3 years old. That's what it says. That's what the claim is. And again, you all you're right. No one believes, everyone, because it's so ridiculous, right? Okay. So the primary source of this that's talked about is the Gemara in Kesubos, or sometimes pronounced Ketubot, right? The way that you would pronounce it. And Ketuba, right? What's a Ketuba? Ketubot, right, is a document. A Ketuba is a marriage document. It's part of the discussion of documents. Now, there were laws that in writing the Ketubah that involved the status of a woman's virginity. In other words, the size of the dowry was different if she was a virgin versus if she was not a virgin. Now, what the Talmud in Kesubos is telling us is that if a man has relations with a girl that is sufficiently young, right, it's not legally effective. Meaning, not that you're allowed to do that, but if somebody was a criminal, an evil person, and did have relations with someone before they were 3, that child when they grow up, they will heal, and they're still considered a virgin for the context of the ketubah. There are certain things in Judaism where virginity is a thing, like the high priest has to marry a virgin. So if a person, God forbid, if a young girl, God forbid, was molested, raped before the age of 3, she will heal and she will still be considered a virgin. She could marry the high priest. Okay, so it's the context of virginity and the preservation of virginity, not that, oh, it's okay to, no. It's a very specific case talking about matters of virginity, and it's any person who does such an evil to a child, or to anybody for that matter, but should be convicted to the utmost sentencing of the law. Anybody. Jew, non-Jew, minor, major, non-minor, anybody. Male, female, everybody who engages in such deplorable actions should be convicted in the highest level of the law, should be punished to the nth degree. The question that's being discussed over here is not, is it permitted to do that? But it says it's like nothing, meaning that if that happened before she was 3, it's like nothing happened in the sense of her virgin status. That's it. The same thing is talked about regarding a male under the age of 9. So, for example, if a woman molests a male who is 9 years old or below 9 years old, would she be culpable for the crime of adultery? Okay? Again, she did an evil act. She did an evil act. And again, this is all legalese. In the same way that anyone who does any crime, that you have to categorize what type of crime it is. If somebody throws eggs at a synagogue, are they just capable for? Are they just culpable for destruction of property, or is it also considered a hate crime? Like, in other words, what legal terminology, what classification does it fall into? Everyone agrees, everyone knows that all of those actions are wrong. Obviously, an adult that has sex with a minor that is under 3 years old is obviously 100% wrong, and the person should be convicted. A woman that has relations with a male under the age of 9, obviously, completely forbidden in the strongest terms. Again, sexuality is only relevant, is only acceptable amongst married people in Judaism. That hasn't changed. The question is, if a woman did do that, aside from being convicted of the damages and the abuse and being held to the account of the law, would she also be in the status of an adulterer if she were married? Okay, and under 9 years old, since the act is not done in the same way because it's before puberty and whatnot, the act can't be carried out in the fullest term. Then she wouldn't be guilty of adultery. She's guilty of abuse. She should be locked up. Everything is like it's not condoned at all. But would she also, under legal statutes, would she be guilty of adultery? The answer would be no. But these are the contexts in which, and so again, these quotations are distorted as writ large, like, yeah, Judaism lets people, yeah, girls under 3, boys under 9, no problem. No, that's not what's being taught over here. Okay, it's either willfully, it's either a gross misunderstanding of the term, or it's an active just concoction of fiction. It's absolutely forbidden in all of the strongest terms. The last claim that we'll do, easy one, that Jews kill Christian children to use their blood to bake matzah for Passover. That's, again, a claim that's been unfortunately rehashed many times. The proof for this that's brought, as a matter of fact, none. There is no proof brought because there's nothing even. In fact, the Torah tells us 7 times that Jews must not eat blood. Right? Genesis 9:4, Leviticus 3:17, Leviticus 7:26, Leviticus 17:10 through 14. 7 times. But the blood libel gave rise to 150 recorded cases that resulted in the murder of Jews, with more being reported. Okay, so again, I want to kind of conclude on these thoughts. What does Judaism? We know what Judaism does not say. What does Judaism say regarding non-Jews? I'm just going to give you just a taste of some of the ideas. So Jewish literature is replete with the sentiment that God is for everyone, that everyone is equally looked upon as a child of God, created in the image of God. God is just in all of his ways and benevolent in all of his deeds. That's what the psalmist writes. King Solomon prays in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 8. He says that when the temple, when the temple, when it was built, it should be a place where the prayers of all people would be received. Okay, this is something that is part and parcel of our tradition. As far as humanity is concerned, the Torah that it has evolved by the design of its creator into a variety of components. There's the Jewish people, there's other nations of the world that have their own various talents and things that they brought to the world. We're like one, there, each part is like, imagine if all of humanity is almost like one body, and each part works together for the sake of general humanity. That is what Jewish tradition actually teaches. The psalmist writes as well, we're taught by the prophets, all the prophets of Israel, that they had mercy both on the Israelites and the Gentile nations. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah are said to have lamented over the misfortune of all the nations, of other nations outside of the Jewish world. We're taught that the world reflects the original intent of the Creator only when there is peace amongst all of the creatures. That's standard part and parcel of Jewish tradition. Rabbi Pinchas Taylor of Vilna, a Kabbalist, in his Sefer Abris, he writes that the mitzvah to love your neighbor means we should love all people, no matter which nation they belong to, no matter what language they speak, because all people are created in the divine image and all engage in improving civilization. Rabbi Chaim Vital, a Kabbalist, one of the pillars of Lurianic Kabbalah, taught that the love of all people, Jewish and humanity at large, was one of the character traits necessary for a person to experience attachment with God. In the Ethics of Our Fathers, the Mishnaic tractate where we're supposed to get our ethics from, it's that Rabbi Akiva teaches, beloved is mankind, for he was created in the image of God. And this is specified, all the commentaries say, meaning all of humanity, not just the Jewish people. Everyone is seen as a child of God, created in the image of God. Any discrimination shown to any human being on account of color or of skin or religious affiliation or orientation or any other distinction amongst people is loathsome barbarity that should be shunned by every single Jewish person. Exclamation mark. The distinction between Jew and non-Jew does not involve any concept of inferiority, but is based primarily upon the unique and special burdens that are incumbent upon the Jewish people and just our preservation of those actions. That's the only distinction that is made, not in the value of human life. In Jewish thought, everything depends on a person's deeds. If the individual is righteous, whether they are Jewish or Gentile, they are considered praiseworthy. Righteous Gentiles in our tradition are called priests, are called pious ones, are rewarded for fulfilling the commandments of God, that God recalls their merits, that they will be amongst the resurrected during the resurrection of the dead, when Mashiach comes, and they all have a share in the heavenly realms when they pass away, the righteous of all the nations of the world. Everything goes by your action, by your deeds, not by your religion or your status in the human family. Okay? So to just conclude this idea, what's interesting, let's just tie it all, bring it all together. The world, each religious tradition tends to focus on, when they count on their calendar, they count from when their religious tradition began. So right now we're in the year 2024, we're going into 2025, right? And what is that counting from? It's counting from the birth of Jesus. Even though, again, from an academic standpoint, that might be a little bit off. That is the counting from which we are counting. Okay, in the Muslim calendar, the year is 1446. What are they counting from? That counts from when Muhammad started receiving his revelations. Right? It's counting from when their religion started. When does Judaism? The year in Judaism right now is 5785. What is that from Abraham? Is that from Mount Sinai? Is that from when the Jewish nation was started, for when the Jewish people were started? No. It's from the creation of Adam and Eve. Because all of humanity, this world was for all of humanity, and every single person has a good and unique purpose. God doesn't make no junk. No one or nothing is superfluous. Everyone has a purpose and a mission in this world. Every person is beautiful in the eyes of God. Everything goes according to our actions and what we make from the talents and abilities that we were given. Everything. And that's why our counting, our calendar, begins from the birthday of humanity. Not our own religion, not our own way of thinking, the birthday of humanity. And so I'd just like to conclude that may we soon merit what the prophet Zephaniah, the prophet Zephaniah says in chapter 3, verse 9, that for then I will turn the peoples of the world to a pure language so that they will all call upon the name of God to serve him with one purpose. May we all soon see the day where all people of the world can unite together, can live in peace together, and rejoice under the glory of God together.